Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be filling you in on everything I read in June and July. So these past couple of months, I've read a total of 10 books. And in terms of genre, I read 4 horror books, some fantasy science fiction, and some contemporary literary fiction, as well as a couple pieces of nonfiction. I'll talk about my nonfiction reads first in no particular order before I jump into fiction, which I'll talk about in order of my favorites. But before jumping into the books, I want to briefly talk about a comic book run I recently reread, Fantastic Four: Dark Reign. This was in anticipation of the new movie, and I had a blast with it. Written by Jonathan Hickman, it's part of Marvel's Dark Reign event, and even in this shorter arc, you can see the seeds of the ambitious storytelling and wild science fiction concepts that he'd bring to his full Fantastic Four run. I've always loved Hickman's take on Marvel. His Fantastic Four run is one of my favorites, perfectly blending huge sci-fi ideas with the emotional heart at the core of the team. I also have to say that I love the new movie, and honestly, I'm relieved we finally have a good Fantastic Four movie. They've always been some of my favorite Marvel characters and stories, and revisiting Hickman's Fantastic Four alongside the film reminded me why this team means so much to me. Now jumping into nonfiction, first I want to talk about a book called Miss Major Speaks, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary. And as the title suggests, this is a transcript of an interview or conversation between interviewer Toshio Marinek and the legendary trans activist Miss Major Griffin Gracie. I definitely won't be able to do this book justice, but if you have any interest or investments in trans right, trans history, issues with prison and policing, sex work, and the AIDS crisis, this is an enlightening and dense read for such a short book that I really recommend. The introduction of this book gives you a history lesson on trans and queer rights and the life of Miss Majors to give you the necessary background for conversation that followed. Miss Majors was a part of the Stonewall riots of 1969, which is widely considered a turning point in the gay rights movement, but also a historical event which trans involvement is often not as acknowledged as it should be. The Stonewall Inn was one of the few gay bars at the time that was welcoming to trans women, and the girls were in the front line when the police raided and Miss Majors was incarcerated. She'd go on to survive Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital, Attica Prison, and the HIV/AIDS crisis, all while founding America's first needle exchange clinics and fighting for collective liberation. The interview format is incredibly engaging and offered raw and honest discussion. Her story is one of resilience, strength, and compassion, and an important story and perspective to read and amplify. There was a lot of points in here I really enjoyed, but I want to read one section that spoke to me in particular, then I'll move on to the next book. People talk about this Trans Day of Visibility someone started a few years back. Whatever image they have in their head or however many surgeries they've had, for a lot of the girls, it's just a fact that on a dark night, a cisgender person can clock them from a mile away. It's our allies that need to be more visible. You can't miss us. We've been visible since time began. The second piece of nonfiction I read is Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest by Hanif Abdurraqib. I did actually talk about this one a bit during my mid-year book tag video. Make sure you check out that video if you want to hear about my favorites of the year so far. This book is a series of essays about the hip-hop group A Tribe Called Quest, but it's not exactly a biography. This book does something cool, which is not only diving into the history of the group and culture at the time, but also discussing what that group meant to the author and relating elements of the author's life to the albums and songs of A Tribe Called Quest. It is also beautifully written, with some sections bordering on poetry themselves. If you're a fan of hip-hop or A Tribe Called Quest, I guarantee you'll find a lot to love in this book. The author, Hanif Abdurraqib, has such a palpable love and passion for the music, and it truly shows in this book. In many places, this book made me emotional, and it reawakened a deep love that I have for this group. And I found myself putting Midnight Marauders and A Low End Theory back in my regular musical rotation in June and July. This book is a love letter from one music fan to a group that shaped his life, and it was really a treat to read and left my music-loving heart full to the brim. Alright, now let's get into all the fiction books that I read in June and July, going in order from my least favorite to my most favorite in this time. I will start with Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. Last year I read and really enjoyed Chuck Tingle's second novel, Bury Your Gaze. I thought it was a poignant piece of social commentary while still being incredibly entertaining as a horror science fiction novel. It specifically tackled the expendability of gay characters in TV and film, and how they are often killed off, but Chuck Tingle tackled so much more in this novel regarding technology and the entertainment industry. It was also just a very compelling story with great characters that made me really want to pick up his first novel. And I finally got to it in June, and I'm so glad that I did because I really liked it. It is a bit more flawed than Bury Your Gaze, which is not particularly surprising because an author should improve from their debut. Similar to Bury Your Gaze, Camp Damascus is a story that uses horror as a vehicle to explore queer themes, in this case the persecution of gay people in American church communities. The title is a reference to a gay conversion camp in the town which our protagonist, Rose, lives. As you might expect, there are some shady things happening at this camp, but I won't spoil much because I thought the reveal throughout the story is where it shines, though not so subtly foreshadowed throughout the novel. I love the concept and the story, but the book fell short to me in its writing and execution. This is not a book marketed as a young adult novel, but in many ways the writing does come across as such. The writing was just a bit simplistic, and it does a lot of over-explaining of its metaphors and meanings. And I did feel this to a lesser degree with Bury Your Gaze, but I thought there was more nuance with the conversations within that novel, such that it didn't bother me. I think this book will resonate more strongly with its target audience, which is queer kids or adults with religious upbringings, and more specifically religious trauma. But for me, I wanted something deeper from this concept and a little less heavy-handed or on the nose with its metaphors. But all in all, still a book I really enjoyed getting through, which I gave 3 stars. I am definitely excited for Chuck Tingle's newest horror novel, which publishes later this year. Next up is a mystery thriller novel I've been seeing a lot of love for online. Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaghay is about a father and his 3 children who live on a remote island off Australia. It is a book concerned with climate change and rising sea levels, and this family is responsible for packing up seeds from the island's research facility to return to the mainland. But one day, a mysterious woman is shipwrecked ashore and seems to be hiding some secret as to why she came to the island. The descriptions of the settings and nature in this novel is absolutely incredible. It was such an immersive read because of how McConaghay wrote about the island's plant ecosystem and the sea life surrounding the island. It struck such a unique and intoxicating tone as the setting felt bleak and claustrophobic in many ways as we see the damaging impact of climate change, but also breathtakingly beautiful and alive. Complementing the isolating setting of this book is its small cast of characters that we get to know more intimately over the course of the story through each of their point of views. It starts off as a bit of a slow burn for almost the first half of the book, which I really enjoyed as we were introduced to all the characters, setting, and mystery in the novel. And it ends with an emotional gut punch, which I think is why people have been so moved by this novel. And I definitely enjoyed this aspect and how it was built up throughout the novel. But I'm not rating this higher because there was a bit of a romance that the author tried developing between the father and the marooned woman, which I thought took away from the story and was unconvincing to me. There's also a particular moment in the plot that I found to be frustrating, which I won't get into because of spoilers. But the good in this far outweighs these minor issues that I had. It was very atmospheric, deeply introspective, and was a poetic and poignant look at the climate crisis. I gave Wild Dark Shore 3.5 stars, and I look forward to reading more Charlotte McConaghay in the future because she is an incredible writer. Next up, I would like to talk about The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Cañas, which came out August 19th, but I was able to get an advanced reader copy. Thank you to NetGalley and Berkeley Publishing Group for giving me a reviewer copy in exchange for my honest thoughts. Isabel Cañas is an exciting author to follow because I feel she occupies a unique niche within horror. She's made a name for herself with her approach to gothic historical novels, incorporating romance without sacrificing horror. I'm a fan of her first novel, The Hacienda, and I presume that The Vampires of El Norte strikes a similar niche. I think if you enjoyed either of those novels, you will not be disappointed with The Possession of Alba Diaz. As you might expect, this book is about a demonic possession of our protagonist, Alba Diaz, but the word possession in this title also serves to represent life under patriarchy in 18th century Mexico and her yearning for autonomy. She's engaged to Carlos from a wealthy mining family, but their engagement is more strategic than romantic in her pursuit of freedom from her own family. Their families together flee the plague and go to Carlos's family's silver mine, where Alba begins having hallucinations and a feeling of something dark taking hold inside of her. Just like The Hacienda, this novel is told from both perspectives of the central romance, in this case following Alba and Elias, her fiance's cousin, as they try to free her from the demon inside of her. The Haunting of Alba Diaz leans harder into the gothic romance, making it a more central element compared to The Hacienda, sharing equal emotional weight with the horror plot. And with the horror plot, Kanya's delivered the gothic atmosphere and setting and tone we expect, with a slow, dreadful build to some surprisingly visceral possession sequences, pushing the gore and grotesque imagery further than what we saw in The Hacienda. And if you know my taste, you know I love a slow build up to a cathartic and graphic horror moments. The writing was beautiful and detailed, and I really enjoyed my reading experience. I would still personally consider The Hacienda a superior book, but this is really close in quality. The first half of the book is somewhat bogged down by its exposition with family and relationship dynamics and the silver mining business, which contrasted the fast-paced ending that felt a little rushed as a result. And the ending was pretty ridiculous, but I found it immensely entertaining, so no critiques from me aside from its pacing. Some supporting characters left more to be desired in their characterization, particularly with some reveals at the end. But this is still a pretty great novel rooted in Gothic tradition while still feeling fresh, taking European and American Gothic structure, such as with The Turn of the Screw or Rebecca, and relocating it to a distinctly Mexican historical moment and heightening the physical horror. I gave The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Cañas a strong 3.5 stars. Next up, I read The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin, which is the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy. I actually completed the final book as well, which I'll touch on later, and you can see my review of the 5th season in my last wrap-up. But I'll speak generally here about what I loved about the second book and the series as a whole, to avoid spoiling anything. This book picks up perfectly from how the previous book concluded and all the world-building groundwork that was developed. In this book, we get more history on our characters, as well as more time spent with a critical character we didn't see much at all within the first book. I loved all of this and everything I loved about the first book, such as the science fiction elements with the magic system and world building, as well as the socio-political commentary, is here in this book as well. We continue getting answers to questions established in the first book, and these reveals were satisfying and I thought perfectly rolled out. The book and the series as a whole was so effectively immersive that I constantly wanted to read. This book perfectly builds up to the final book, which I'll discuss more, but this is an incredible middle book in an incredible series. I gave The Obelisk Gate 4.5 stars. Martyr is the 2024 debut novel from poet and author Kaveh Akbar. And what an incredible debut this was. This novel was so beautifully written, it was poetic in prose and fluid in structure that wanders through time and perspective, and even alternating between reality and the abstract in a few memorable moments. And because it's so loose in structure, it is difficult to explain its plot, but its emotional center is within conversations had between our protagonist, Cyrus, a depressed, recovering alcoholic Iranian-American queer man in his 20s, and a performance artist named Orchidea, who is terminally ill and spending her final days as an exhibit at a New York art museum. The scope of this book is so ambitious, taking on themes of grief, addiction, suicide, cultural identity, religion, and, of course, martyrdom. It is often a difficult read. These topics are portrayed raw and realistically, but also with a lot of grace and some dark humor, making this a deeply moving book. It was a bit over the top in its ambition of its storytelling, but I think that was to its benefit, because if it had been a more subdued or linear story, it wouldn't have had the impact that it did, at least for me. The major plot developments in the last few chapters of the book were unconvincing to me, but the musings and vignettes that made up the rest of the story really took this book to another level. This book had a lot it wanted to say, and in my opinion, it was largely successful. If you aren't a fan of poetry or literary works, or books that are melancholy, I wouldn't expect you to like this book at all, but if you do, I think this lives up to the hype it's been receiving. I gave Martyr by Kaveh Akbar 4.5 stars. Next up, we got a big one. I have finally read The Stand, which many Stephen King fans consider his greatest work. And I think it is undeniably his most ambitious work compared to the many novels of his that I have read. Ambitious in its endless cast of characters and the scope of the world and conflict they inhabit, and ambitious in what it seems like King is trying to say about humanity with this apocalyptic horror epic. There are two versions of this book, the original version published in 1978, which was just over 800 pages, and then the complete uncut version, which was published in the 90s and added about 300 pages to the story. I read the uncut version, as I think most fans would recommend. The book is divided into 3 parts and tells the story of a global pandemic of a disease called Captain Trips, which was developed as a biological weapon by the US government, but is accidentally released and kills 99% of the human population. The first section of the book follows the spread of the flu and introduces us to key players within the book while civilization quickly collapses. This section is by far my favorite because it almost reads like a collection of horror vignettes, each showing a different horrifying moment as the disease spreads. And because of the length of the book, King is able to linger on these haunting snapshots, like entire towns sitting silent with dead bodies laying in abandoned vehicles. Or there's a particularly chilling scene of a soldier gunning down civilians at a roadblock to keep the illusion of control. I love how it didn't just focus on individuals, but also zoomed out to show the larger systemic horrors, with the government covering up the truth, censoring the media, and even murdering citizens to suppress panic. It felt disturbingly realistic, like exactly how the US government might handle a crisis on this scale. And the pacing of this section really worked for me. The slow creeping dread at the beginning, eventually exploding into total chaos by the end. Now, while I didn't love the next 2 sections to the extent that I did the opening, I still found a lot to marvel at. Book 2 slows things down as the survivors start to rebuild, and I'll admit there were moments that felt a little tedious with all the politics of recreating democracy within the community. But at the same time, I did appreciate how philosophically dense it was. King really digs into questions of what kind of society should rise from the apocalypse, and how fragile these ideals are when people are desperate and afraid. Then in Book 3, the lead up to the climax is fantastic, as the forces of good and evil march toward confrontation. Now, the actual resolution of that conflict left me a bit unsatisfied, but I still love the journey getting there. Taken as a whole, though, I agree that The Stand is a masterpiece. The characters feel so real, and the antagonists are terrifying, and the atmosphere is unforgettable. I love how King uses the sprawling cast to explore the scope of humanity, both at our most compassionate and our most monstrous. Theological parallels are also fascinating. There's a real sense of Armageddon in the Book of Revelations here, with Mother Abigail as the prophet figure and Randall Flagg as the devil, and the survivors caught between faith, free will, and destruction. It elevates the story into something almost mythic. Not just a horror novel about a plague, but an epic fantasy of good versus evil, written on a biblical scale. For me, it stands as one of King's greatest achievements, and I'd give it a solid 4.5 stars. Next, I'm excited to talk about Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, a book that floored me with its beauty, heartbreak, and eerie, suffocating atmosphere. This book blends genre in such an interesting way, sitting somewhere between literary fiction, horror, and magical realism. This book follows 2 women, Miri and her wife Leah. Leah is a marine biologist that goes on a deep-sea submarine voyage that goes horribly wrong, and when she returns home, she is not the same. The story alternates between time and perspectives, with Miri's perspective in the aftermath, trying to reconnect with the woman that she loves, and Leah's perspective and accounts of what happened aboard the submarine. That's about all I'll say plot-wise, because part of what I found powerful in this book was the slow unraveling you experience as the reader. And what really struck me is how Armfield blends literary horror with deeply intimate relationship drama. The portrayal of Miri and Leah's marriage is the emotional center and one of the most moving aspects of the book. Their relationship is portrayed realistically, both tender and complicated. While there is suspenseful and tense submarine sequences and flash of body horror, I wouldn't say this is a book that would appeal to a conventional horror audience. I would say it's a little more niche, as it leans more towards literary fiction and magical realism. It reminded me a lot of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, especially in the way it utilizes cosmic horror and the unknown depth of the ocean. The ocean itself becomes a kind of character, terrifying, unknowable, and yet beautiful. Armfield captured perfectly the deeper you go, the less we understand, and the scarier it becomes. And that brings me to the prose, which is absolutely stunning. Armfield uses water imagery and ocean metaphors throughout the novel in some compelling ways. The story itself is separated into sections titled after depths of the ocean, progressing deeper as the story unfolds. The novel isn't plot-driven, but instead it's introspective, sitting with themes of love, loss, and how we cope with the unexplainable. I also love the ambiguity of the ending. It leaves questions unanswered, which worked for me because it reflects themes of the novel, and how the depths of grief is portrayed as something hard to fully make sense of, just like the depths of the ocean. But I can see why some readers might want a clearer resolution. But overall, Our Wives Under the Sea is haunting, heartbreaking, and beautifully written, and for me, it was an easy 5-star read. The final book I want to talk about is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin, the conclusion to the Broken Earth trilogy. This was my favorite book in the series. For me, The Stone Sky was everything I wanted to close this series. I couldn't have asked for a better ending. It tied together all the threads from the 5th season and the Obelisk Gate. The stakes are higher than ever, and the reveals hit a full emotional force with a satisfying, though heartbreaking ending. One of Jemisin's greatest strengths in this series is how she expands the scope of her world with each book. The Stone Sky, we get an even deeper dive into the origins and history that shaped everything we've read so far. The amount of world building and lore that Jemisin packs into this trilogy is incredible, and to me, never feels overwhelming or like an info dump. It always seems to serve the story and the characters. As I've discussed with the previous books, I admire how Jemisin uses the fantasy world to comment on her own. The trilogy is about survival, but also appears to comment on systemic oppression, generational trauma, and cycles of violence. Looking back at the trilogy as a whole, I think that each book got progressively stronger. The 5th season was a brilliant introduction, dark, complex, and unlike anything I've read in fantasy before. The Obelisk Gate expanded the scope and raised the stakes while answering key mysteries. But The Stone Sky brought everything home with emotional weight, breathtaking imagination, and a satisfying ending that felt exactly right for the story, as it had been telegraphed from the very beginning. This is how you end a trilogy. I loved every second of it, and I honestly think that the Broken Earth series will be considered a classic in a couple decades. If you love science fiction or fantasy, I'd say this is essential reading. I give The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin 5 stars without hesitation. And that is all the books I read these past 2 months. Thank you so much for hanging out and watching my video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss my next video. If you've read any of these books, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Or let me know whatever books you've been loving lately. As always, happy reading everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.